Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Data Ideas Podcast. I am your co host, Brandy Beals. And my co host, who's usually with me, Dustin, is not able to make it today, but we have an amazing guest for you all today, Alex Izydorczyk. He's the founder and CEO of Cybersyn, the data as a service company creating a real time view into the world's economy with 7 years of experience leading the data science team at Cotu, a 70 billion dollar investment manager, right? Alex brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. As the architect of Cotu's data science practice, he led the team of 40 plus people in leveraging external data to drive investment decisions. Alex's background in private equity data infrastructure also includes an investment in Snowflake. And his passion for real time economic data led him to start Cybersyn in 2022, which is really how I came to hear about Alex and hear about Cybersyn. So I'm really excited to have you today. Thanks, Alex.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So as I mentioned, you went from data scientist to CEO in less than 7 years. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about your background and career journey?
Yeah, sure. So I joined Cotu as kind of a research analyst back in 2015. I think the really interesting thing about the buy side, so hedge funds, venture capital firms, is they're these pretty flat organizations overall, right? Like they don't employ a lot of people relative to how much capital they deploy. And so, the benefit of working in a place that you have a lot of resources, but it's small, is you get a lot of sort of access to decision makers, to mentors, to, you can kind of be in the midst of things pretty early. And so I joined Cotu and sort of grew the data science effort there. We sort of built out a team, and it went from, kind of being let's use some data to help make an investment decision to, let's build a process, or let's integrate, our investment decision-making process with sort of a data-driven approach. And then Cotu grew as well. So while I was there, the firm kind of launched a private equity side, they launched a venture side. And so as that organization grew, like my team grew almost, proportionately within it. And as you mentioned, I kind of had the extremely good fortune of also getting a lot of exposure to Snowflake while at Cotu with the sort of investor hat on. And, Snowflake, I think, was a great investment for Cotu, but more so than that, we were users of the platform, big fans of the platform, and I had the opportunity to get to know some of the folks at Snowflake, which meant that when I was thinking about sort of what comes next, I had the opportunity to chat with them, and very interested in data as a service businesses. I think they're kind of a category of business that maybe doesn't get talked about very much, and is sort of, I think a lot of people would struggle to name, 5 data as a service businesses they admire, unlike maybe like software as a service or something. But I was very interested in them, and I think that there was a strategic angle to work with Snowflake on this concept. So here we are.
Yeah, I think that's really exciting. And I agree. I think the data as a service idea or concept isn't talked about very much. And I think that's one of the things that really stuck with me when I heard you speak at the Snowflake Summit last year. And I know that we'll talk a little bit more about Snowflake later on. But you mentioned your role as the head of data science. You were on the data buying side. What gaps did you see in the data marketplace when you're kind of in that role?
Well, I think marketplace is kind of an interesting concept. So I think in general, data marketplaces haven't worked, right? So historically, enterprise data buying is kind of a martini lunch kind of like enterprise sale, right? You sort of negotiate the deal on a one-off basis. You've got an account executive at every data company. You're probably working with 5 to 6 of the largest companies in your industry, and you just have like a contractual relationship with each company. And then that is entirely separate from the sort of technical data delivery that that happens where, the data vendor sends you an SFTP or sends you a flat file, or, in the world of finance, like what was very popular for a while, before sort of cloud took over, was you would deploy a virtual server in your own environment, and that virtual server was provisioned, in some cases even maintained by the data as a service company. And that virtual server, would call home, download the data, put it in a database, and give your data scientists access to it. That was the kind of like historically most advanced model for data delivery. And I think what Snowflake did was they approached it not from, let's start with the data sales. They started with the technology of just data sharing. And so I think when I was at Coatue, that data sharing was becoming very popular, and kind of like the most convenient way to transfer data back and forth between organizations, including between sort of a buying organization and a selling, gas company, if you will. So I think that the thing I saw as like the potential for a marketplace was really that, as more and more data, as people wanted to use more and more data sources, and you wanted to go from 5 or 6 sources to 500 or 600 sources, there's this question of like, okay, how do you manage all those relationships, all those contracts, all those technical pipelines, most importantly, right? And could you tie that all together somehow? And I think Snowflake Marketplaces kind of represents an opportunity to do that. I think, for what it's worth, I think marketplaces in general have a bunch of advantages, right? They're self-service. In theory, they could be like, they can help you discover data really well. So, when you work with legacy data service companies, like one of the things that's shockingly difficult to do is to just see a data dictionary of everything they have in their organization, right? And it's not necessarily that they're trying to hide it from you. It's just that there's different product teams, and there's data that's available externally and data they have internally, and maybe they would make that available if you were willing to pay for it. And I think in some ways, as marketplaces have the promise of making like that discovery process self-service. But it has to come, like that piece is great, but I think it has to be tied together with the technology platform you're using as well to make it kind of seamless.
Yeah, I love the idea of self-service. The discoverability aspect, I think, is really critical, right? And I think while you mentioned kind of talking about starting from the technology piece and getting that right, I mean, it kind of boils down to some degree to user experience, right? Like, how can we deliver this data? How can we make that experience just a lot better? So I think, that's just a lovely answer to the kind of some of the gaps that you were seeing in that, when you were kind of in that role. So what made you want to start Cybersyn then?
Yeah.
And why now? Why is now the right time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I think everybody's born with like a mission that they're passionate about. And, my mission happens to be economic data, or real-time economic data. I was always interested in economics and kind of the cross-section of computational economics and statistics and so on. And, the piece there, we've been collecting data on the economy in kind of the same way since the mid-century. And so there obviously is room to innovate around kind of getting real-time, more granular, more accurate data in kind of a digital world. So I think that was the mission. I think the actual opportunity, the business opportunity, came about because Snowflake, had this awesome marketplace data sharing technology, and there's this question of like, okay, how best to take advantage of this? And if you think of Snowflake as like the Netflix, you could think of Cybersyn as kind of like the original content for that Netflix, right? So I felt that there was an opportunity to build this content layer on Snowflake, right? And I also felt as a data buyer that a lot of the existing data vendors or data providers were maybe leaving room on the table, right, for competition. And I think there's a few things about data as a service industry that made it so. I think, one, every industry has one or two monopolistic or duopolistic providers. So, data as a service is kind of like a winner take most or winner take all sort of dynamic. But I think when the winners have been the winners for like more than 10 years, there's this kind of innovator's dilemma where, as a buyer, if you want more granularity, more innovation, more detail, it's harder to get that from your supplier. So I thought that there was some white space, especially as it came to this kind of economic data. I think what's really changed in the world, today's DaaS company from, a DaaS company 30 years ago, I think a few things are really different. One, the economy's totally digitized. So there's nothing you could do that wouldn't be recorded in a database that's an economic transaction, right? Even if you pay in cash, that's getting recorded in the digital ERP system of wherever you paid in cash. So basically everything's digital. That probably wasn't true 15 years ago. That definitely wasn't true 30 years ago. And it wasn't true in most of the world, as recently as 5 years ago. So I think that's one thing that's like meaningfully different. I think a second thing that's very different today is the structure of cleaning and transforming data is changed because of LLMs, because of AI. So all of a sudden, the amount of effort and the number of people you need to clean up data or take semi-structured data and turn it into structured data is just completely different. So I think that is a second transformation. And then I think a third just industry trend is for the last 10 years, companies have been getting on the cloud and becoming data driven by using their internal data. I just have a hypothesis that external data is the next kind of leg to the stool, where you take Netflix for example. You hires many really smart people, PhDs. Those people build recommendation algorithms. Those recommendation algorithms get incrementally better. And so now there's a question: is the next improvement in that performance going to come from hiring another 50 PhDs, or that generate more features or generate better algorithms, or is the next improvement going to come from the fact that maybe if you had your competitors' data or insight into what your customers were watching on the competitive platforms, that would just be a step function improvement to the algorithms that are becoming commoditized. So I think everybody had to look inward and make use of their internal data. But once they've done that, the next step is to look outward.
Yeah. And I think, I certainly, that resonates with me. I certainly see that and experience that same thing. I think regardless of who you are, I think we can all see the digitization that's going on around us, but also, just this massive amount of data that we're producing. And so I think, the business model of Cybersyn is really fascinating. It's, again, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast. You talk about economic data a lot, and I follow you on LinkedIn, and you post about the difficulty of working with some of these publicly available data sets. I think there's lots of data that the US government and other governments, I'm sure, produce. And you talk about the difficulty of working with them. What does it take to become an expert in some of these publicly available data sets? Because I know, Cybersyn, you have lots of data that you provide in the Snowflake marketplace. And a lot of that is some publicly available data sets. I would love to just know a little bit more about what it takes to really work with that data.
Sure. So I think public data and public data infrastructure is a little bit of a conundrum, right? I think on one hand, I think the U.S. government is actually really good at publishing data. Like we have a really capable Census Bureau and other kind of statistical organizations that publish incredible amounts of detail on the economy and measure a lot. So I think on one hand, open data and sort of publicly available data is a pretty incredible resource, and you can sort of do a lot with it before you get to proprietary data. I think often the amount you can do surprises people. Now it often takes wading through documentation and so on and creativity, but I think in some sense the data asset is really good. I think the challenge is, and what you have to become good at, and hopefully Cybersyn can kind of grease these wheels a little bit, is data discovery is hard because there's many different agencies, and so if you even just getting a sense of what all federal agencies publish, let alone federal, state, local, county, municipality level agencies, and then you mix that with sort of independent foundations, international organizations, other countries, and their entire government systems. I think just finding what you need and whether it exists somewhere is very difficult. So like I think you have to read a lot. You have to sort of find ways to kind of bring that all together. I think that's one. I think two is data harmonization is hugely important. And I think one of the big things we're working on at Cybersyn. So and again, I mentioned how LLMs make this a little bit easier, but it's one thing to have 10 different data sets. The next question is kind of join them together. And as we all kind of know, for those of us who's kind of like spent any time working in a BI tool or in a data science environment, like there's 50 different ways to spell Washington, D.C., right? And so how do you make sure that all the references to Washington, D.C. and its a geographic entity on some hierarchical level is properly mapped across data sets? That's hard. It's hopefully going to get easier with AI, but this like data harmonization piece is, I think, the second really difficult kind of skill set. And then I think the third component is getting really, so if there's like data discovery harmonization, the third piece is sort of just methodology. And I don't know if there's a skill here, beyond, basic kind of statistical literacy, but, there is a lot of nuance between public data sources. And so, to give one of my favorite examples, the Bureau of Labor Statistics published there's the sort of unemployment rates, which everybody is kind of familiar with. And then there's sort of the number of jobs created or destroyed, right? And those actually come from different surveys. And one of the things that really drives the difference in those surveys and the conclusions you could come to is that they survey different populations. So one surveys businesses, the others, and payroll, the people actually doing payroll, the other surveys consumers. And so you get a lot of these edge cases, like, what happens if a consumer is employed at multiple businesses? What happens if a consumer is employed in, a rural or household setting? And you stack up these little issues, and all of a sudden you can come to these kind of contradictory conclusions where, like, the number of jobs in the economy is being destroyed, but the unemployment rate is going down. And so I think a big skill set in using these public data sources is being meticulous and kind of caring about, both the statistical methodology, but also the sort of just economic detail around what is it that you are actually measuring, and is that thing that you're measuring the thing you care about? And even when you start working with proprietary data and start mapping that proprietary data to public data sources, these like nuances really matter, right? So I find myself asking questions like, does, when the census publishes consumer spending, does that include sales tax or not, right? And does that include sales tax at the state level? Does that include sales tax at the municipal level? What happens if a county charges a vice tax? Is that included or not included, right? And that can make pretty significant differences in the growth rate of some of these time series and in the conclusions you draw. So I think that the third piece that I think makes you great at using public data is this kind of like attention to details, statistical literacy, but also just creativity or knowledge about the economy.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of things that that we talk about in the data book club that I run. I think one of the key messages in a lot of books about how to, whether it's visualize data or analyze data or think about data or use data, it's most of these books don't actually talk necessarily about like how to create the best bar chart. It's really about like, are you understanding where your data is coming from and how it was collected and what these numbers truly mean? And I think you've provided some really great nuances, but those nuances become important. And so, I think it's really great, how you think about these data sets and how it just, I guess, from my perspective, you are such a good steward of these data sets, and you're not just taking them off of, the census website and putting them on Snowflake Marketplace. You're injecting a lot of like expertise along the way. So that's just, I guess, my perspective on what you are talking about here. But love that perspective. Can you talk a little bit more about how Cybersyn, like what Cybersyn makes easier for its customers, and really kind of who your primary audience is?
Yeah. So I think Cybersyn has kind of a two aims, if you will, or we're working on two things that are outwardly facing, right? So on one hand, we're working on all these public domain data sets, and on the other hand, we're working on proprietary data sets that we sell on the Snowflake Marketplace. And so I think on the public domain data side, the audience is super broad, right? Who doesn't use census data? It's an extremely broad audience. But I think the value, or what we're trying to make easier to that extremely broad audience, is to make the data joinable across sources, right? And discoverable, and hopefully better documented, or at least better synthesized. But I think what you'll find in all the Cybersyn data sets, or at least what we aspire to, if you don't think so, you should tell us, is we try to normalize the data into consistent formats. So kind of using a very consistent kind of schema design for all data sets. And one of the things with using a consistent schema design is you sacrifice the ideal schema per data set for consistency. So it's like, and we've been willing to make that trade-off where we say, okay, this might not be the ideal schema for this one data set, but it's the ideal schema that can span data sets, and that is more valuable. So if you're the type of organization that uses a lot of public data, you'll probably find our structure and our sources quite helpful. So that's sort of problem number one, is just usability of these public data sets. We're also on Snowflake, of course, so the technical ETL ingestion step is just much easier than if you were sort of calling APIs, having to maintain the orchestration and sort of downloading data, checking when the data source updates, pulling that data down. I mean, all of that's kind of handled for you by Snowflake. So you just kind of subscribe or mount one of our data sets, and it's just a table in your Snowflake instance that updates automatically every time the sort of government source publishes new data. So I think we're trying to make that a lot easier. And I think simultaneously on the proprietary data side, we're trying to publish data sets that give you a level of granularity or a level of speed, and therefore a level of insight that you couldn't get from public data, right? So if the US Census publishes monthly advanced retail sales, which is kind of an aggregate sales number, we want to be able to give you detail on how individual companies stacked up to create that, individual geographies at the CBSA level or zip code level stacked up to create the result you see at the national level. And so there we're solving, a data availability, problem first and foremost, and kind of a information advantage for our customers. But again, we still have to make all of that data hopefully consistent in form and in joinability with the public data.
Yeah. I think everything, as I listen to you talk about, the amount of kind of steps involved in, it's a lot of work. I mean, I think anybody who's worked with any sort of data set, right, trying to normalize it, getting it into a proper form, these are not small tasks. And I think, there's this, I don't remember where the statistic comes from, but that like data analysts and data scientists spend up to like 80% of their time on, ETL or data transformation, data cleansing, and all of that. And it just, not to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like, Cybersyn really kind of takes away a lot of that, a decent amount of that effort, right? And so then, Sorry, go ahead.
That's definitely the hope, right? Is to take away some of that effort, and not just for data scientists, right, but also for data analysts, right? So anybody who's working with data at all, and I think the bar for working with data has, from a technical perspective, is decreasing, and I think will continue to decrease as better and better tools come out. Again, maybe partially driven by AI, but as that technical bar decreases, what increases is kind of the number of people that have questions, right? And sometimes, the best questions are coming from the folks with domain knowledge, with the business knowledge, with the sort of like nuanced view, where, maybe they can't write the SQL to express that nuanced view, but they actually have like a very specific question that you would only ask if you were running that business. And so, hopefully helping those people is something we do as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I that whole concept of just, the democratization of data and making it like lowering that bar, or, that barrier to entry, I think is huge and really valuable. So, again, it's been really exciting to see, Cybersyn and this idea of data as a service. Really, I think you guys are doing it really well. And
Thank you.
so really excited to just continue to see how, the products that you're coming out with, the things that you're working on. One of the things that I, again, saw on your LinkedIn profile, was that you have a Cybersyn data catalog. We talked a little bit about data catalogs at the beginning of the episode here, but you have this Cybersyn data catalog. It's built on Streamlit, right? And curious if you could maybe talk a little bit more about why it's important to have that data catalog.
Yeah. So again, I think it comes down to discoverability. And I think Snowflake's doing a lot in their marketplace to make data more discoverable. I think what we wanted is to take advantage of kind of like the bleeding edge features that you can implement in Streamlit to make Cybersyn's data in particular super searchable. So, I think we cover more than 50 data sources, right? So 50 government agencies or international organizations like the IMF, UN, and so on. And it gets to a point where even in our own Snowflake instance, we're like, oh, wait, I want exchange rates, or I want, unemployment, by, in Canada. And it's sort of like, okay, where is that again? And so I think that being able to experiment to sort of find these kind of data sets is important. And again, there's a lot going on with semantic search, and that I think we really wanted to be able to experiment with. And so that's kind of what our data catalog in Streamlit really tries to do. Streamlit is a very cool tool. It's a company or a startup that was bought by Snowflake, has very tight integration with Snowflake at this point, but also allows us to expose things, to the wider internet. So it's been a lot of fun to work with it.
Yeah, I haven't worked with it myself yet, but eager to jump in. And I just thought your use case was really excellent. So yeah, really excited to see that. You've been talking a lot about Snowflake, and I think to see how your relationship with them has evolved is kind of really interesting. One thing I wanted to kind of point out was that Cybersyn received a $63 million investment from Snowflake. Yeah. Why? I mean, you've talked a little bit about why they were the right partner, but curious if there's anything else to add about really why they're an ideal partner for Cybersyn.
Yeah. Well, first, I have to give some credit to Coatue and Sequoia. So we raised $62.9 million, but also from Coatue and Sequoia. Snowflake was the lead, so they're kind of the big partner. I think, as I mentioned before, like Snowflake has built, they started as a data warehouse company, right? And I think data warehousing is, one function, but they've morphed into what they call the data platform, right? Or, the cloud data platform. And I think that cloud data platform needs to include and solve challenges, not just for IT groups or not just for engineering groups, but also solve challenges for business groups. And that includes data science, but also includes the CMO, the CRO, sales, operations, so on. And so, in some sense, one of the ways to do that, I think, is a content strategy. And I think Snowflake Marketplace and collaboration supports that content strategy. And so I think where Cybersyn fits really well is, again, if Snowflake is building the cloud platform, then we're trying to build the content for that cloud platform that's unique to Snowflake. And that's symbiotic, right? It's win-win for us and for Snowflake. And I think in some ways that's why the relationship makes sense at a strategic level. At a more tactical level, they've been fantastic to work with. We do a lot of private previews and sort of have used a lot of their kind of cutting edge, bleeding edge features that they've announced. So everything from Snowflake Cortex, which is their sort of LLMs in Snowflake capability, to Snowflake native applications, which is kind of their platform for sharing not just data sets, but actually sharing code and applications in the form of either dashboards or UDFs. And so it's been, they've been a good partner to work with them on some of those like bleeding edge tools on that we get to be sort of like a guinea pig and try it out, but also solves real problems for our customers, right? So it's one thing to sell a data set. It's another thing to sell a data set that comes with a bunch of UDFs that you can use to get started with the data set faster.
Yeah. Yeah. It really seems like you guys are kind of growing together. And yeah, I thank you for elaborating on that. It's really, again, exciting to see how this space is evolving, because it's evolving quickly. But it also feels like, the areas of growth for Snowflake are really smart, and they're the things that we really need. I think they're solving a really big need in the the whole data ecosystem. So really cool to just get your take on Snowflake, and kind of where Cybersyn fits in there.
Yep.
Really love that. What is the next frontier for Cybersyn? Thinking about the future a little bit more, what's next?
Yeah, I think this year really has to be the year of proprietary data in addition to our public domain data. The frontier for us is really launching some of the early attempts at our proprietary data sets that we've been acquiring, putting together, and building over the past 12 months. So I think over the course of the next year, you can really expect us to launch a series of kind of proprietary data sets and sort of put that to good use. So I think that on the product side, that's priority number one. And I think that priority is followed by second as making use of some of these advancements in LLMs, particularly in the context of Snowflake Cortex, to again take unstructured data or semi-structured data and turn it into structured data.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we're all familiar with unstructured data and the value that's in that, right? I think ChatGPT and other AI and LLM type of tools have really made it apparent what can be done with unstructured data. So I'm really excited to see what your take on that is in the future. So so that's really super exciting. I think we're reaching maybe the end of the episode here. Curious where people can learn more about you or Cybersyn, or if there's anything else that you want to chat about that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, please find us on the Snowflake Marketplace. I think we've just launched kind of a revamped doc site, and we've been putting a lot of effort into that, trying to get feedback on it. So please find our listings on the Snowflake Marketplace, and then check out docs.cybersyn.com. And then look, I run a personal blog at magis.substack.com. Well, not fully personal, personal and professional, kind of related to Cybersyn, but also related to data science more broadly. So to kind of follow my broader waxing on data science, check that out.
Yeah, I think you talk. I know you wrote something about like analyzing web traffic and just kind of how I think that's I think you provide this amazing service, but I also just love hearing your take on something that is kind of very specific, right? This specific use case, right? How do you, Alex, think about that? And so I definitely encourage people to read your personal thoughts as well. Thank you so much for your time today, for joining the Data Ideas podcast. It's really great to get your perspective. Again, I can't say it enough. I'm so excited to hear or to see, how Cybersyn evolves, how data as a service evolves. I'm really excited. It's an exciting time to work in data. So thank you so much for your time today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. And for those listening, if you've liked this podcast, please rate it, share it, and subscribe. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.